All right, can you guys hear me? We got about 2 minutes. We're going to get started. If you haven't been out to the wood burning the stove demo, it's pretty darn slick. So on the next break, maybe head on out there and look at it. Okay, everybody, let's get settled in. We got about 30 seconds and we're going to get started. Barbara, you want to start making your way up here? Okay, so if you haven't been out to the wood stove demo, we're going to keep that going for another a couple of hours. It's pretty slick how they set that up. So if you didn't get a chance to see that, please take some time to do that on our next break. Let me transition quickly to our next topic. And so our next topic presenter is Barbara Trost from the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. A quick bio on Barbara. Barbara holds graduate degrees in physics from the State University of New York, Albany, and University of Heidelberg, Germany, and a Master of Science in Atmospheric Chemistry from the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. Barbara has been at DEC since 2001, and since 2008, she has been the program manager for the Air Monitoring and Quality Assurance Program. Barbara manages the state's air quality monitoring program to ensure compliance with national air standards and protection of public health. Her responsibilities include statewide evaluation of ambient air quality to support the development of effective control strategies and the implementation of effective solutions, working with the public to address potential sources of hazardous air pollutants, joint monitoring efforts with the U.S. EPA, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service air quality staffs, and providing technical support to local and tribal governments and industry monitoring efforts. So, please join me in welcoming Barbara Trost.
Okay. Hope I don't need the 30 minutes. Nick asked me to present on some of the plans that we have for monitoring moving forward, and I thought it probably is a good opportunity to just go through what we have done so far. I hear through Nick and through meetings that we've had in Fairbanks now over the past 10 years that people don't really know what we're doing. People just look at the maps and see what kind of monitoring is out there. There's some questions about how we select the locations that we've have selected where we have monitoring, and often there's a complaint that people think we don't know enough about what is going on in the community. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the regulatory monitoring network. There's certain reasons for why we have to have monitors where they are, sort of the history of how this all came about, the type of studies that we have done. We've done short-term monitoring in combination with the borough for the last 10 years. Just touch briefly on the North Pole saturation study that we completed last year, and then show the locations for the Fairbanks Borough school monitoring that we support as the state. And then the new monitoring site that we have selected, we're going to try to get that monitor up and running for a high-impact site in Fairbanks, which has been identified as a complaint from the community. So you've heard this before. The area was designated in 2009 as a non-attainment area for PM 2.5. That designation was based on one single monitor that we had at the time. That was the state office building monitor. At roughly the same time, EPA was working on a network designed for the multi-purpose sites, the National Core Network. Every state gets one. We decided in the state that we would put it into the location of the city that had the worst air quality in the state, just because we wanted to get the additional information. The state office building site also had PM 2.5 as just pure mass concentration, but also had our chemical speciation site. And the idea for these multi-pollutant sites was supposed to go to these the CSN, the speciation trend network sites. In our case, we couldn't put it there because the site is on top of a roof of the state office building that just roof couldn't structurally hold more equipment. So my predecessor was working with the air manager for Fairbanks to try to find another location that was close enough, and that is where our current NCORE site is at. I think the idea for them at the time was, or their hope was, that they would get rid of one of the sites, which we have not been able to do because the state office building site is considered the violating monitor, and EPA has been trying to make us keep that site. Then in 2015, as part of some of the other monitoring that we have done, I'll show a map later on, the North Pole site was made a regulatory site, and that's basically those are the two main locations: the downtown Fairbanks monitors and the North Pole site. You will probably, if you follow us, you will see that we have renamed the North Pole Fire Station 3 site to Hearst Road site. For one, we apparently always used the wrong number because it wasn't really the North Pole Fire Station, it was the North Pole Volunteer Fire Station, and actually the real North Pole Fire Station is getting a lot of contacts from citizens who let them know that the monitors are not working, which they have nothing to do with, and even if you guys called the volunteer fire station, they wouldn't be able to do anything either. So in trying to help let the firefighters do their job and let us do our job, we're renaming the site. It hasn't moved, it's still at the same location. But again, the downtown sites here, just so people probably have seen it on the maps, but those sites are very close. We are aware of that, we're not idiots. Well, maybe we are, but in this case, this was done with the intent of being able to join those two sites. So we were aware that two sites are very close and they're not going to be that different, and we see it in the data, they're not very different. In terms of other monitoring that we've done, this is a map, it's very busy, but the stars are the regulatory sites. So you can see in North Pole, we've got the Hearst Road site, and then the two sites in downtown Fairbanks. The circles are all the short-term sites that we have had since 2008 that have operated more than a month. So we have more data. We started collecting data in 2007 when we already knew that the area was going to be designated, mostly to try to figure out where to draw the non-attainment boundaries. So the focus of the longer-term monitoring was trying to figure out where are the sources. Some of this happened very early in 2008 and 2009 when we were still trying to figure out what source contributions do we have, what is actually, what sources are causing the problem. So the color codes in here are not necessarily meaning clean or dirty, that usually people use the red, green, yellow. In terms of the software that we had, that was the only color code that we could use. But basically, the red colors mean that those sites, on average, have reported higher values than the regulatory sites. And basically, we've done some averaging, and we've looked just at the days when the sites, the regulatory sites had an average of 20 micrograms per cubic meter for a 24-hour period, and just averaged those days up. So we are aware that there's a couple of areas in Fairbanks that are, over the years, have been consistently higher than the stationary, than the regulatory sites. And then we also have some data for North Pole and for the Badger Road area that indicate that there might be some areas that are higher. Well, let me go back. The borough basically was running this program until the middle of 2016 when they handed back the program to the state. During that, before that time frame, they were doing quite a lot of work in North Pole trying to figure out is the Hearst Road, is that really sort of an anomaly, or is that more reflective of a larger area? So because of that, we conducted a saturation study. I presented on that last year, so I'm not going to talk that much about it, but we did a 3-week study where we set up 12 stationary sites. The number 1 there in the center, in that green circle, that is the Hearst Road, the North Pole Fire Station site, and then the 12 other locations around it were basically close to residents. We got the power from them and were allowed to set up in their yards. And then the orange roads routes are basically the routes that our sniffer vehicle drove. The sniffer vehicle was very closely set up to what the borough uses for their sniffer vehicle. So as a result of that study, we figured out that actually most of that area within that red circle was pretty much saw fairly close values to the North Pole Fire Station. Some were lower, some were higher, but overall, we felt like the North Pole Fire Station was probably pretty representative. And I should say the Hearst Road site was pretty representative. Then when the state took over the regulatory monitoring because of budget cuts at the borough, we already said at the time we don't have the staff to continue the special purpose monitoring that the borough had done. So we shrank our network down to those 3 regulatory sites. At the same time, the borough had a contractor, they started the previous year to put out some lower cost monitors into schools, and that started in 2015-16, it extended then into 16-17, and then we continued it last year as well. So this is the network of schools. All of those are elementary schools. We are still looking at the data and analyzing it, so I don't have a nice color-coded map of that, but it shows you again where that we do have data for the area. We're not just basing all of our information on those 2 regulatory sites. You folks probably get most of your information from the Fairbanks Borough website, but this is a picture of our website. It's old and it's probably a little fuzzy, but all of those school monitors, those low-cost monitors are communicate with our website and then also communicate through that with the borough's website. Currently, since they're not in the schools, they're not operating, they're not displayed, but when they are displayed, you can see sort of in the lower half where it says Interior of Alaska, the top two lines are for the regulatory sites, and then everything below that has sort of a where it says SPM, Special Purpose Monitor, and then it has the elementary school with the AQI for that school, for that day. And so that data is going to, the list of sites should go back up again as soon as the borough's contractor gets started, and I assume that's going to be sometime in October. Those are the two websites that you can get the data. So, even though we said we cannot do any more special purpose monitoring, the discussion in the community has been that the advisories that are called for North Pole and for Fairbanks are not necessarily representing every condition in Fairbanks. And so there are these two areas that we are aware of. One is the Dale Road area, and then the other one is the Hamilton Acres area. We know that from the short-term monitoring that we have conducted previously and from the sniffer data that the Borough still continues to gather every winter. So we spent some time looking at the data that we have gotten from those school monitors. We've looked at some of the data that was also collected by a contractor from some of the neighborhood monitors that the Borough deployed. That was 2 years ago. They deployed a number of, I think it was 9 neighborhood monitors into that Hamilton Acres area just to sort of see if they could use that as an enforcement tool. We selected a new site that we also will display on our website. The data will be used, I assume, well, the state will use it for air quality advisories. I think Nick said he was going to do the same. And again, we have the hope that we will be able to eventually move the equipment that we have at the state office building to that site, just because we don't have the staffing to continue adding sites to the network. We will have that, so we have an agreement and approval from the Nordale Elementary School to put the site there. We've spent some time driving around that neighborhood. We've looked at the data that the Borough has in terms of wood stove changeouts. We're trying to find a representative location, so we're not just going around and just plopping a monitor down. There is a lot of work that goes into selecting a site. In this case, we also need to be able to have the site there for the long term, so that usually means not going to some private property, because they can kick us off at any point, and trying to have enough space for a monitoring shelter that can be there that's not in anybody's way. And so the school has allowed us to put this on the back of their property, sort of in that, on that green space that they have. We were actually hoping to have the site up and ready already, but we're running into some snags with the power hookup, but hopefully we'll get that resolved here next week, and then the hope is to have this site up and running by the middle of October. I would just want to show a couple of slides on some of the data that we've used to select the site. Again, there's also a lot of information in this. Again, here's a larger area of the downtown Hamilton Acre area. You see the 2 regulatory monitors sort of on the left-hand side. Those are the squares, and that is continuous data that we have selected from those sites. And then we have the Nordale site, or is that diamond. That was where the short-term monitor had been. The borough had operated a short-term monitor there from 2007 through 9. And then the circles are the neighborhood monitors that the borough had set up there in 2017, yes. And we're basing this on roughly on I think it's a 6 to 7 week period that from January through March. The shades of purple are going from light to dark, meaning the darker that is, the higher the concentration. In this case, we have just looked at average concentrations of the days when the concentration at the NCORE site was over 20. So we're trying, again, just to look at high pollution days, not just looking at average days, because we're trying to be conservative and find a site that is really going to show us the worst air quality in the Fairbanks area. So the location, again, there are obviously areas that see higher average concentrations or saw higher concentrations in early 2017. They're kind of close to the China there. But then we looked at the sort of a similar setup, but then we looked at the maximum concentration. So before, the purple was the average concentration for any days over 20 micrograms per cubic meter. This is for days where we have data for the maximum of those days. And so that picture is slightly different. You see different areas that are darker, and so we feel like we're in a pretty good spot. We're not necessarily in the highest spot. We're also not necessarily in the lowest spot. Again, we're trying not necessarily to set up a monitor right next to one polluter and then basically regulate one person. We're trying to make sure that we're capturing sort of the average air quality. So I guess that's basically what I wanted to show. I think people often don't understand or don't believe that we're putting a lot of work into selecting sites. It is a skill and it is science, and we're not always doing it right, but we are working really hard to get the best location. So I think that was it.
Do you have time for some questions?
Yes.
Does anybody have any questions for Barbara? We do have some questions. Wendy, take it.
So the 3-week saturation study that you did in 2017 in North Pole, did that cover all climatic or climate experiences? Did it cover inversions, non-inversions, and would that make a difference in your saturation study?
We actually were lucky. It did cover most of the conditions that we see in North Pole. It did not cover the very severe cold, but we had events with concentrations of up to, I think it was 80 micrograms per cubic meter. So we had inversion events. We had a clean out where basically the air came through, so we saw that the instruments were responding to the cleanup. We saw again that it started the concentrations came back up, and then I think there was even sort of a snow event that basically then took out the pollution again. So we feel that we've captured a fairly diverse set of climatic conditions, and we feel pretty good about the results of it.
Sorry, just one more, because he didn't take the mic away from me. Because I don't do the studies, I read the studies, is 3 weeks long enough to get an accurate picture of all PM 2.5 concentrations in the area as a form of a study, or would longer periods be needed to get a real accurate measurement?
Well, the intent of the saturation study was to identify whether or not the long-term site was in a good location. So the regulatory site is still there. The saturation study was supposed to figure out if it is in a good spot. And for that, 3 weeks is a normal time frame for a saturation study. We spent a lot of time with the contractors that we had to make sure that we actually getting into the time frame where we can see various types of pollution events, and we even postponed the study for a little bit because at the time the concentrations were low, and so we pushed it off for a week to actually get the more intense time period. So we feel pretty solid on it.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Barbara? I got two coming over here. Let me get Jennifer first. I'll come back to you, Jimmy.
So I know that the purpose of monitoring isn't necessarily for enforcement, but if you look at an area like that and you see that repeatedly a particular area has a high level, like the ones that were 88 or 91 or something in Hamilton Acres area, do you work with the borough at that point and say, are you aware that this is, I mean, I know that they know that's a area of concern, but the specific, kind of little corner or whatever, does that information bring about any kind of education for the people that might be unknowing polluters? Or is there not much of a connection in that regard between the two levels and the citizen?
So the neighborhood monitor, so those dots that you saw in the Hamilton Acre area, that the data was, at the time was used specifically for trying to see if the instrumentation could help identify areas that had higher values, or even maybe be used by the borough for enforcement purposes, basically as an indication, oh, the concentrations are going up, we need to look in that area who is potentially not, is putting out a lot of smoke. So the data at the time, this is sort of, we're looking at it after the fact. It's been, that data that we had just looked at. And I think the contractor for the borough at the time was specifically working with the borough to identify those areas. So yes, and in terms of the regulatory sites, obviously the borough is looking at the data on the same time frame that we are, but we are in communications when we see something that is unusual. We communicate, but we also have a meteorologist on staff who works closely with the borough to look at the data, to look at the forecasts, and so they're in constant communications.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Barbara. Fascinating information. So the daily, or that daily average and then the maximum average for that Nordale neighborhood was interesting to me, and I just wondered, has there been an attempt to look at any correlations with the stages, the air quality alerts, and did those numbers change in response to air quality alerts?
Well, we didn't have, we just started looking at the data. So, and we have not yet looked at it in terms of how any of that, how any of those values from day to day changed with, in response to advisories, but it is something that we could look into. What I didn't mention before is that the neighborhood monitors are another low-cost monitor, and they don't have the best performance. So in this case, we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that we could compare them internally to each other, so that we could make the color coding or the shading of those dots. But we also found that they're not necessarily comparing that well to each other. So in terms of an enforcement tool, they're only as good as the quality of data that they put out, and so at best you could see a trend, and I wouldn't necessarily look at it in terms of real concentration numbers that we can calculate, but that might not necessarily mean a whole lot just because the technology isn't as sophisticated.
Thank you, and thank you for all the time and energy you're putting into Fairbanks. And so to follow up, you mentioned watershed, or well, it was on the map there. And was there what was the what went into the decision to look at Nordale versus the watershed area?
Yeah, thanks. I forgot to mention that too. We talked to the borough staff when we were going through this. We looked at the number of complaints that they were getting. We were looking at the larger area, and we were trying to put a site into an area that covers the most people and still has, fairly high values. So the borough, we met with the borough's sniffer drivers, who I think just have a fairly good feel for an area, and I think we came to the joint decision that probably the Nordale site would be one that would serve the community the most at this time.
Thank you.
But I also want to say that, we are going to keep the school monitors going, at least for this year, and then it kind of depends on, obviously on funding, on whether or not we can continue that. But I think that with the new technology and the sensors becoming cheaper and cheaper, that there is opportunity for setting up another set of a network. The regulatory monitoring obviously has a very defined purpose, and that is to provide the data that is needed for all the regulatory actions for the SIP. There's other technology that's out there that could be used in the community to indicate areas that see an increase. Again, my main concern is that we are getting very hung up on various numbers, concentration numbers, and we tend to compare hourly readings or even instantaneous readings to a 24-hour standard, which is not the way to go, because it doesn't really mean anything, but everybody mentally has sort of an idea, or they see these colors and they think they understand what's going on, and I think there's a lot more to it. So with that, just getting more cheaper sensors into the area would be good for maybe a trend analysis to see sort of a distinction between good versus bad air quality, but really not that people get hung up on an actually concentration number.
Okay, Barbara, we have one more question, and we're going to wrap this up.
So mine isn't necessarily a question, just sort of another observation. I'm glad that we got other monitors in other residential areas in town, in Fairbanks. One of these sort of problems that North Pole had is that we felt strongly that the regulatory monitor in town was that we were comparing apples to oranges, because the regulatory monitor in town is in a non-residential area, and the monitor in North Pole is smack dab in the residential area, and they're regulatory, they can't move. But we felt that it skewed the real-time data, because the monitor was not in an area in Fairbanks where people were burning. It was a business district. People aren't burning there. And so it just sort of, it skewed the numbers just a bit. Not that that is, the numbers are good there, but people don't live there. And so I just wanted to make that observation, that I'm glad that other studies or other small monitors are getting placed, because now we can get real-time data about other areas in actual Fairbanks that burn wood, and we can compare them to the areas in North Pole that burn wood. So I think that was a good thing to do. So thank you.
Yeah, and the Nordale site is in a neighborhood area, and so
Thank
that'll
you.
be interesting data to see.
All right, Barbara, thank you for your time this afternoon. Much appreciated. Well, okay, so we are going to move into our next panel discussion, and those of you that are on a panel, you know who you are. Start making your way up. Don't need to call you out. Denise, you're coming up. Nick, Cindy, Tim. Who else is on that list? Where's Glenn Miller? He ran out screaming. Okay. You got it. I'll introduce you, and then you'll go. You need some water? Yes, I'll get you some.
I want to remind people, if they have not, this is the only number number of people that have signed up to win
Okay.
the woodshed, and I've got tickets.
Okay, so while everybody's getting set up, this is all we have in the drawing bucket for the drawing this afternoon for the door prizes. So after this panel discussion, we'll get somebody to draw a name out of the hat, or 2 or 3 or so. I'm not sure how many door prizes we have, but we'll do that here in a little bit. You want to put that back out there, Lenny? So the next panel discussion will be with Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, Fairbanks North Star Borough Air Quality Division, and the EPA representatives from the EPA. And I am going to step aside, and you're going to get a new facilitator, some guy named Mayor Castle. So, Mayor Castle, it is all yours. And I'll get you a drink. Oh, you use that. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. So we are going to have questions. Most of this program should be questions from the audience. That's you guys. But I'd like you to write them down. And I have some questions left over from this morning to kind of get us going while you have your think tanks on, coming up with questions. And Jim's going to be collecting questions. There's lots of cards on your table, so please fill them out with good questions. The real hard ones would be wonderful, especially for the state folks. We love asking the state folks hard questions. So anyway, we do have, before I back up, or I'm going to back up before I start, I was outside looking at the burn demonstration going on and duly impressed. I was walking up and I was a little disappointed because there wasn't a huge difference between the two stacks. I mean, one was darn clean, the other one was smoking a little bit. And then I was informed what the moisture difference was between the two wood sources being burned in there. One at 15% moisture, and the other one was only 28, 29%. We were looking at 13 or 14% differences all in moisture content. And then when I went and looked at the graphs on the computer, holy smokes, the heat output difference was incredible. The one stove was running at 700 degrees, and the other one was down to 700 plus. The other one was down in the 300 range, half the heat coming out at the same time. Incredible. So check it out, and we'll do that some more, aren't we, Glenn, through the course of today and tomorrow. And it's really shocking to me to see that just right in your face with what's going on. And it was getting worse as it was going. The numbers were closer together at the beginning when they were first lit, and the dry wood was just really getting going. Once it got going, the differences got more and more dramatic. The dry wood kept getting cleaner and hotter, and the wet wood kept getting smokier and less heat. So anyway, check that out. It's really good. On our panel, we have representatives from the state DEC, also federal EPA, and our local borough air quality division. So these are the folks that are running the program right now from top to bottom, working together as a team, and I'm proud to be a very small part of that team. Starting closest to me, this is Nick Zarnecki from our borough air quality division. He's the manager there. Cindy Heil from state DEC is next, and Cindy's been working on this. How many years have you been working on Fairbanks air quality for the state? Can you think back that far?
2009.
2009, only 9 years at this. Thank you. Next at the table, Glenn Miller. He's our transportation director, so he's blessed with having the air quality division within his department and helping keep Nick pointed in the right direction. Next in line is Denise Koch from DEC, in charge of the state's air quality division down there, and has spent quite a bit of time in Fairbanks helping us out. And you've been at air quality here too on our problem for a number of years, haven't you, Denise?
3.5 years.
3.5 years, so a lot of experience with us. And at the far end, our federal representative from the EPA, Tim Hamlin, from Region 10 EPA. And he's been coming up here for several years now, sitting in with us. We're all...
Hey, Carl, it's the third year, but it feels like many, many more.
I think maybe. It's my third year, too, as mayor. But this is the end of a very long week for us because all these folks have been here since Tuesday morning, and we've been meeting all day, every day, all week here, working on this, combining notes and comparing and chatting and trying to work through different strategies and what's the best approach. So a heck of a lot of work from this team. We were joking it was like Thanksgiving homecoming for the extended family because we've been meeting like this just once a year for a week. And we sometimes discuss things like family, like brothers that are going toe-to-toe, or sisters can do that too. But we're all part of the same family and team, and actually it's been a pleasure to work with these folks. At least I've been pleased to work with them and find out that we can work as a team even when we have different opinions on things. So I'll get started with some questions that were left over from this morning. Some of them are still pertinent to the discussion. If you have questions for the folks that are running the program currently, these are those folks. Please write them down, wave your hand. Jim will come by and pick up your questions on the 3x5 cards, and we'll keep this moving. I'll throw this out to the panel for starters. Data that we've been collecting, because obviously good decisions are based on good data. Do we have any on how many residents only have a wood stove as their primary source of heat? We know how many no ashes there are, but do we know how many folks are in that capacity in our community? I guess, Nick, that's probably for you.
Yeah, so I think the survey data that was collected, 5 years of survey data from I think around 2010 to 2015, suggests that the number in the non-attainment area is around 500 folks out there have wood as their only source of heat. All right.
Anything to add from anyone? If you have something to add, get my attention, and we'll try to not stay too long on one question. I got a good hard one now. We can have everybody chime in on this one. What do you see as the current barriers to improving our air quality? What's the toughest part of this equation? Where's our biggest bottleneck going forward? Who wants to start? Who's brave? I'm going to hit all of you, so you might as well go first. Tim, start us off. Why not? Come on.
Man. Ready to let her go. Okay, we probably have similar answers. So, I mean, obviously, I think what we've talked about today, wood is readily available. If you don't count your labor, it's basically free. It can be a great source of heat, and unfortunately, it's also our primary source of air pollution. So I think the heart of this matter is figuring out how do we have, for those who need to burn and want to burn wood to stay warm, how do we move folks off wood and onto less polluting fuels? It seems like there's a lot of opportunity. I really appreciated the interior gas utility presentation, gas coming to the community at a price lower than heating oil seems like a really good step. I think, though, in the end, it is a little bit of carrot and stick. We need to provide incentives or subsidies for folks to move off of wood, and we probably need to continue to have a curtailment program that provides the incentive in a different way to do so. So I think it's all about those elements, and has been and will probably continue to be.
Denise?
I'll add to it. I agree with all the things that Tim said. The one item that I would add is, in terms of the challenge, is time. So I think that so DEC has been working really closely with the borough, and you've made a lot of progress in the last few years. It hasn't been enough progress, but you have made a lot of progress. The challenge is that we lost a lot of time at the beginning of this process, since the area was in non-attainment, designated in non-attainment since 2009. So I feel like, in addition to the items that Tim had mentioned as the time challenge, I feel like you've got a lot of momentum going now, but now it's a bit of a race against the clock.
Mr. Miller. Glenn.
So I see this, the biggest challenge, it's kind of an ongoing, but it's a big challenge, is the cost of energy and the efficiency of the existing homes that we have. That's something that there really hasn't been a lot of focus on as far as the efficiencies of the homes. We're still constructing homes that are less than the most efficient homes that we can build. And of course, we have the cost of energy here. And I know natural gas has been a focal point. The bigger concern is, what is the cost of natural gas going to be? If the cost of that energy is still high, There will still be individuals that don't want to burn wood because this is all about economics, as we've heard from many people in the community. They're trying to heat their homes in an economical fashion, and if they don't have good alternatives, whether that's fuel oil, propane, natural gas, whatever that may be, it's going to be a difficult choice for them to switch over and stop burning wood.
All right, Cindy.
I should have went first because you guys took all the answers.
Well, you can agree with them.
No, I agree with them completely, and I think it's what exacerbates it is the combination of time and cost. In order to get into attainment timely and address, the health needs of things that people need quicker, earlier now, it's going to make a cost. It's going to cost a lot, and where's the money going to come from? I mean, a lot of people are expecting the government, whether at the state level or the local level or the federal level, to come help them to do that. If you want the problem fixed, you pay for it. But we don't have the money to do that. So I don't know. I think that's one of the biggest barriers, is because it's going to have a cost, and where is that cost going to go, and how is that cost going to be distributed and dealt with? Otherwise, I don't know how we're going to solve the problem. The other thing is the big perception. With the wood burning community, they're not the bad guys. They're just trying to survive. We've heard that. I would like to think of as the curtailments, which is kind of a disagreement, as a consequence of other control measures not working. So what we need to do is we need to get other control measures in place. We need to make things happen so that it's possible to burn responsibly. And that's going to take time, which we don't have a lot of. So it's a combination of all those things that makes the barrier or the complexity of this community so unique and so difficult. It's because it is complex, and it is going to be very difficult. But I think we're on a good path to getting there, and the stakeholder process has been really awesome, and I cannot wait to see what they have to give us in the next couple months.
And Nick?
Yeah, there's not a lot left to talk about with some of the major issues coming last on the panel, but I will add that the magnitude of the problem is such, if we kind of boil it down to a simplistic number to hit, that we need somewhere around 80% emission reductions. And if you look at this from the standpoint of where are we going to find those emission reductions, there aren't a lot of control measures out there that are going to net us the reductions that we need. And anybody can sit down and pencil out a plan on paper that'll show where those reductions are. But then it's the implementation, and if that plan is palatable to the community, that's one of the most difficult barriers, and that's what the stakeholders group is tasked with, is to look at all these control measures, turn over every stone, see every bit of emission reductions that we can find, and which ones the community can live with. And so I think that's one of the toughest barriers.
All right, thank you. We have questions pouring in. These folks write fast, and they give great questions. They're knowledgeable. This one rolls off of a question that we ended the Let Barbara's program with regarding the monitor in the city of Fairbanks here near the Borough building, and the one out in North Pole being regulatory, one being residential, one being not such a residential area. And we have a number of other monitors within the Fairbanks area that we look at. So the question is, does the current Fairbanks regulatory monitor, how is it correlating with those other monitors that we have in the Fairbanks area? Is that correlation indicating it's fairly representative, or are we seeing differences between it and the other monitors in the Fairbanks core area? So some of those monitors are borough and some are state. So who wants to start on this? Denise looks like she's jumping in.
I'll take a shot at it. There's a lot of variability between the monitors, especially on the coldest days with the strongest inversions. I mean, you wind up, Barbara was talking about the saturation study, which I know is in North Pole, and this question was about Fairbanks. But I think it's true to say that during the strongest inversions, when it's coldest, we wind up having the air quality is pretty localized, and that effect is found not just in North Pole but also in Fairbanks.
Nick, are you seeing the same sorts of?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, and you know, unfortunately, we haven't looked specifically at the correlations between those, but that's something that we certainly could do. And I think I'll agree with Denise that there's just a lot of variability in the monitors because of, you know, where they're at spatially within the borough, and these pollution levels they change rapidly, and there's really small hot spots and pockets that pop up, so it's a very complex issue.
Glenn?
Yeah, I think something that would illustrate that well is some of our maps for the hotspot guidance program. When the vehicle drives around various parts of Fairbanks and North Pole, it identifies hotspots, and sometimes near the monitor, the regulatory monitor, it's relatively clean where we identify hotspots in other locations, and sometimes it's just the opposite, and it isn't the same every day. So some of those maps really illustrate the difference in the different hotspots that we can generate throughout the community.
All right, thank you. Okay, I have to do a qualifier now. I'm getting buried in very similarly focused questions because there's this big elephant in the room that is going to be let loose on October 2nd as a ballot initiative. And everybody should know that we can't, as government employees, advocate a position per se. We can provide facts, and we've got a lot of questions here. So we're going to try to tiptoe through the questions without really expressing opinion per se, but try to provide facts and how this whole system network is put together and what impacts might be back and forth depending on how we go. So what are the impacts? We'll start with this one. It's kind of generic. Let's start generically on this topic. What are the impacts if the borough should give, this is the way it's phrased, give the air quality program back to the state? We could put a bow on it and give it to Christmas present. What would change? What would likely change? Who wants to start on it? We need at least, Denise is brave.
I'll start. I'm going to start with some of the items that will stay the same in terms of, we do have at the state, Barbara had mentioned, we have a meteorologist. We already run the regulatory monitors. We would continue to do that. We have the authority to call stage alerts. We have, DEC has an office in Fairbanks. We have compliance staff in Fairbanks. We would be responsible for doing the compliance and enforcement associated with the different stages. So those are some of the sort of the big pieces. You'd still have regulatory monitoring. You'd still have stages. You still have compliance and enforcement. Some of our tools are different. What would be different is that, you know, you'd have not all of the programmatic staff would be in Fairbanks. Right now with a local program, of course, you have all local staff. We have local staff because we have a Fairbanks office, but there are a number of us that are based in Anchorage and Juneau, so some of those decisions, the programmatic decisions, would be made from those locations. They'd be out of the community.
Nick, what do you see changing?
Yeah, from the borough's side, you know, of course, we would, you know, anything that had to deal with the regulation or prohibition of solid fuel burning appliances, the borough would not engage in those activities anymore, and so that means that the curtailment program would not be run out of the local office anymore. I think Denise did a good job of explaining how the state would pick up those responsibilities. The borough would focus their resources on the education outreach and continue the hotspot guidance program. And then there is a question of whether or not the borough would be able to continue to administer their wood stove changeout program due to some issues there.
Okay. If community members wanted to make changes to the curtailment program, how would any such changes be accommodated based on who is implementing the program? So if the borough's running it, if the state's running it, or the EPA is running it, how do community members make changes? Nick?
I'll take the shot at the borough level, and then maybe we can work up the regulatory chain. So at the borough level, the curtailment program is implemented through local borough ordinance, and so any significant changes to some of the main thresholds like 25 microgram or 35 microgram is done at the assembly level, and that's accomplished through ordinance. A good example of that is the retrofit ordinance that recently passed, where at the borough level, we're able to make those changes pretty nimbly, and that retrofit control device ordinance allows approved devices to operate up to 55 micrograms per meter cubed and gives an exemption to stage 1 and stage 2. And so, it's something that we heard at the local level, and we were able to work pretty hard with a bunch of folks to get that implemented. Another example is this past winter there was a gap in what was available for a no ash versus what was eligible for some of our wood stove changeout programs, and the assembly acted very nimbly to close that gap so that folks could that were not eligible for a no ash could apply through the wood stove changeout program for all instances. We never intended for that gap to be there. It was just an issue with some of the federal funding that we had. Those are a couple of examples how the borough can adapt rapidly and change the ordinances. And then there's also the policy level decisions, and this is how the curtailments are called. Being last year we were fairly conservative with the way that curtailments were called, and those are things that we can do just out of our office, and so they're local policy things, and we're in touch with the local community, and we can chat with folks and adjust policy as necessary. And so that's how you would change the curtailment program when it's at the local level, and then I'll pass it on to the state.
Hang on a second. And one question on what you said, so that folks are clear, because I'm not totally clear. When you said we were conservative on calling alerts, what's that mean?
So when we took a look at the data, and don't quote me on these numbers because I'm just going off the top of my head, but for in North Pole, for instance, when we looked back at the data, we had called somewhere in the like 28 days worth of stage 2 burn bans in North Pole, and the monitoring data suggested that we warranted somewhere around 40 some. And so we were really conservative, and what that meant was when we're making that call in the local office, we look at, we have a PM 2.5 forecasting model that gives us data 3 days out that says, forecasts what the PM 2.5 levels will be. We have National Weather Service data, and we also have sounding data that looks at the strength of the inversions. And the discussion that happens amongst staff, it includes DEC, forecasting staff, borough forecasting staff, National Weather Service, and we talk about how certain we are that we're going to enter into a stage 2. And at the borough level last year, we felt it was prudent that when we were making those decisions, we only made them when we had the highest level of confidence. And that definitely showed in the data when we reviewed it.
Okay. How does the public interact with the state, Cindy, going forward? You're in charge.
Well, our curtailment program is already set in our regulations and in the state implementation plan. In the episode chapter, it lays out what the borough's curtailment program is, and it lays out what the state program is. We have the same levels. Alert would be at 25, and we could call actually curtailments at 25 or alerts. We don't have to wait until later. We do allow waivers, but we probably wouldn't have the same types of waivers that the borough has. So we typically don't do a lot of regulations unless there's a federal requirement to change regulations, or there's a really big need to change the regulations. It's very expensive. So I don't think, as Nick says, we're not very nimble. States isn't very nimble. We're kind of slow. But we do have a plan. We do have a curtailment. All the regulations and everything's in place. So we would just follow those rules that are already there.
All right. Tim, is EPA as nimble as the borough?
Nimble. I'm really glad you asked that question. Nimble was one of the words I was going to use. I think so this is a little speculative. It hasn't really happened before that the federal government's had to, it would essentially mean we were doing a federal implementation plan. So we'd have to write that plan and then implement it. Obviously, we'd be looking to what's been done here, but we'd also be looking to what's been done everywhere else in the country. And we pretty much would be obliged, I think, to say whatever was the most stringent effort anywhere is what we would put in our FIP. And so I guess it's a little bit speculative, but I would say you should expect way less nimble, way less flexible, way less responsive, much more one-size-fits-all. If that's what you're looking for, okay.
So I'm a little confused. I think you said you hadn't done this before, but there have been FIPs and federal engagement elsewhere.
We haven't done a FIP for a 2.5. I'm not aware of a FIP for 2.5 in a dynamic where we have the source characterization we have here, primarily residential area source problem. We have done enforcement in Alaska. I cut my teeth when I started with EPA 25 years ago on Alaska placer mining regulation. And when we first went out to visit placer miners, they didn't know why they needed a permit. They didn't know why we were there. They met us with guns. They told us to go away. I expect we might have some similar experiences if it came to doing a FIP in the non-attainment area. We would keep at it, just as we did there. We would keep at it here. But I guess I don't want to, you're inviting me to play the gorilla in the closet, and I'm obliged to do that to some degree. I really want to send the message that there's no doubt in my mind that everyone who works at EPA and DEC and the borough firmly believe that the Clean Air Act requirement's not going away. And the best way to achieve compliance with the Clean Air Act is continuing for us to work in partnership with each other, continuing to have the borough work closely with the community members they serve, and for EPA to continue to provide technical support, for EPA presumably to continue to provide funding through things like targeted airshed grants. We would much rather be helping in those ways and working with the state and the borough as creative ideas are brought forward and interest in things like electrostatic precipitators is brought up, to figure out how to work together to look at those options and opportunities rather than go on our own and develop a FIP. But I think it's, without knowing all the particulars, I think the less nimble, less flexible, less responsive, more one-size-fits-all is what you could expect. And And exactly how we do it, we'd have to figure some things out too, but I know we'd keep at it just like we did with the placer miners. So I'll leave it at that.
You brought up ESPs. Number of folks in the community brought the ESP, electrostatic precipitator, concept to the borough, and we kind of pushed it up through the system. Everybody at the table got engaged in it and whatnot. What if that offer started at the other end of the table and someone in our community brought the ESP proposal to the EPA and put it on your desk? What likely would have happened to that suggestion?
Well, I can tell you many of us are quite dubious that while ESP is a proven technology in the industrial context, trying to apply it in a residential context looks extremely challenging. And what Nick provided before, I thought the slide about what they were doing in Switzerland was illustrative of something that would make sense. But I think EPA's general response would be to say, no, forget about it. And maybe at some point, if we were to consider it, we'd probably consider it with the Swiss model in mind. You'd have to have all those bells and whistles for it to even be considered, and we would probably spend a lot more time than with the local community engaged in running it. There's more resources available to consider it, and essentially a built-in lobbying group to advocate for it if it does prove to have some promise. We wouldn't have the time, resource, or inclination to be as interested in figuring out that answer, given that we start from a place of being somewhat dubious about the ability of that particular technology to work in the residential context.
Cindy.
So when this first came up, the timing was such that I had an opportunity to go back east to a cordwood reference method testing group. And this was made up of a number of states, a lot of northwestern states, Minnesota, a lot of the northeastern states was called NESCOM, industry, EPA, because they're trying to develop a cordwood test method that's more real world to try to see if they can't get the wood stoves to be able to handle real world conditions a little better. And I brought up the idea of an ESP, that Fairbanks is looking at this, and asked why hasn't Washington done it, why hasn't Oregon done it? And we actually had a guest speaker from Europe, and their whole thought was, Fairbanks, well, your guys' units are probably too big, your wood is too wet, you might get by with a commercial grade ESP, but these little units, oh no, they won't be able to handle it. And nobody was willing to even really talk about it. They're doing huge amounts of testing for cordwood development, and they're not looking at any retrofit devices at any of the labs, at any of the states, because they're just not working with the volumes of particulates that they're concerned. Their focus is they want to find the ability to get these stoves redesigned to not be tested and certified with cribwood, which is dimensional lumber. They want stoves that are designed to handle cordwood, realistic, with bark, with variable species. So that's where the money's going right now, is to try to do testing and engineering of devices that can handle our stuff, not as add-ons. So nationally and partly internationally, from what a counterpart that was on the phone from Europe, we don't have a lab. DC doesn't have a lab. We don't have an in-state. We don't have the money. And so looking at all of our peers and asking all these people who have oodles. I mean, these guys have been doing cordwood and stove testing in Washington since, the 70s and the 80s. They're the ones that the first state to outlaw outdoor hydronic heaters as a state, okay? All those that came up here. I mean, these guys are way on the forefront of testing and knowledge about what's available for wood stoves and wood smoke control. And none of them are doing aftermarket or retrofits. So that Fairbanks is taking a step to try something and actually doing testing, we're being watched nationally to see how that goes. Everybody's really interested in it, but nobody else is putting money towards it. So I really think that it's a very unique opportunity for the borough, from what you guys have done, to actually make progress, maybe see something that others haven't seen yet. So we are seeing aftermarkets in competitions, for innovative competitions around Portland, or not Portland, but Tacoma. Tacoma did a challenge to come up with some ideas, and they have some add-on devices that look promising, but still nobody's done any additional testing on them yet. There's some national, back east, there's some competitions getting ready to happen again. So it's, there's a lot of people trying to do a lot of things yet, but there's a lot of reluctance yet at our level, at least the states and our counterparts. They're not putting any investment in it right now.
I'd like to add on to that. I think that the ESPs are a prime example of a program that really was generated at the local level. You have a local ordinance. You have locally allocated funds for it. As both Tim and Cindy mentioned, at a state and federal level, we're pretty skeptical. But you had a local program, you could move forward, and EPA provided a lot of their technical support and trying to develop some of those testing methods. But this kind of links back to an earlier question that we received about differences between a local program and a state program versus a federal program. I don't anticipate that we would get any allocation of funds to do the testing for ESPs that you've received at the local level. So I think that's purely a local program, and I think it's unlikely that we would have the funding and the resources to do that at a state level.
Thank you. So I have a number of questions. We're still sort of revolving around the theme of who's running regulation in Fairbanks, whether it's borough, local, state, or EPA. And these are questions kind of all related to that one way or another. I'm trying to group them together. To Denise, does DEC have enforcement ticketing power? And can they get that authority if they don't have it?
So the technical term is administrative penalty authority, and this comes up pretty often because the borough, of course, has a stage. You have your stages and the restrictions. I know even at the borough level, the first thing that you work towards is compliance assistance, and there's been a lot of outreach that the borough does before they ever actually issue a ticket. I mentioned that the state has different tools, and we do not have administrative penalty authority. We could not issue you a ticket in the way that the borough can issue you a ticket. I think our compliance and enforcement in some ways is more sparing but more painful maybe when we actually have to put our full force behind it. We, of course, I think any entity tries to do outreach and compliance assistance first, but we all know that you need to have tools beyond that. We can issue things like notices of violation. We have the ability to collect penalties and fines. We can negotiate with people, and ultimately we can take somebody to court. Of course, that does not happen very often. It's pretty resource intensive for everyone involved, including the agency, but also an entity that is being brought to court. So I think that's why I would characterize it as maybe less frequent, but more painful.
All right. Uh-oh, I just lost my quick question. I had a quick one. Okay, I lost my quick one, so we'll go to a longer one. We've gotten millions and jillions of dollars from the EPA for wood stove changeouts, et cetera. If the borough residents vote to remove borough authority to work on improving our air, how might that affect our ability to get more help from EPA and Congress, the federal government?
So the way the Targeted Airshed Grant Program works is it's only eligible for those who are recipients of 105 monies, so the state. We're the only entity that can apply for a Targeted Airshed Grant. So we apply for a Targeted Airshed Grant on behalf of the borough, and then we pass the money on to them. So we would be able to continue to put in applications for Targeted Airshed Grant monies. But it's much nicer that we get an application from these guys, and then we put it through, and then we give them the money, and we don't have to do much work. So we don't have a lot of staff to do a lot of that. So it's really nice to be able to be helpful to the borough. But it's, you know, we can continue to apply for Targeted Airshed Grants regardless.
And I would add on to what Cindy had mentioned that we certainly are allowed to apply for Targeted Airshed Grants, but even asking for money takes money, essentially. I mean, you need the resources to have people to write the grants, you need to have people who actually implement the program, and with our, with our current level of staffing, that's not something that we have. So that's the borough, as Cindy had mentioned, really just, it's really the borough's program, and we just serve as a conduit.
And I guess I have something to add. So the way those grant applications are reviewed, it's all about what sort of reductions come per federal dollar. If the state isn't as well equipped to deliver a program that reduces emissions, the likelihood of getting the grant funded, winning the grant competition, is reduced. I don't want to say that it couldn't happen. It just looks to me harder for DEC to continue to successfully compete if the resource base that's developing the grant applications is diminished. And on a practical level, I mean, Denise mentioned timing earlier. There's so much to do I mean, to show continued progress and avoid the beginning of any federal sanctions on the transportation funds to the borough. It's hard to do everything, and the fewer people who are being asked to do things, the more we'll end up focusing on the things that feel like they're most likely to move the community in the direction it needs to go. I'm not sure what that means, but I don't want to speculate, but I do worry that it means more emphasis on curtailment and less on changeout.
Okay. To the borough, can you still find, if you lost control at the ballot box, could you still find nuisance burners? Because we have a nuisance burning ordinance. None of you are attorneys, but anybody want to take a stab at where that might go?
Yeah, and I'll take a stab at this. From what I understand, we would lose our ability to do that as the borough.
Okay. I'm going to combine two questions here. If Prop 4, which removes the borough's authority to regulate wood stove, passes, what would the next steps taken towards compliance with the PM 2.5 NAAQs, and who would enforce? And would this benefit or be detrimental to the compliance timeline? And this goes along with what will DEC do if Prop 4 passes?
Okay, so I'm responsible for getting the SIP done, and I still have to get a SIP done. So regardless of the vote, we will be moving forward to getting the SIP. The stakeholder program is independent. The recommendations of that group is either going to the borough and the state, because some things will be better fit for for DEC to do, some maybe do for the borough. If they can't do it, we'll do the best we can with the stakeholder recommendations, fit those in with the authorities that we have. We'll add whatever else we need to do to fill a gap, and then we will move forward with getting the SIP submitted as fast as we can to get it turned into EPA as soon as we can. So that's what our intent is.
Nick. Denise, go ahead. You can jump in
I just
front
want
of
to
Nick.
finish the add on to what Cindy had said on the compliance side, just to reiterate, we do have compliance staff in Fairbanks. We do have the ability to run the forecast model. We do have a meteorologist who can call the stages. So we still have the ability to do those things.
Right. We still have on regulations for DEC no open burning during the winter months. We still have standards for wood stove sales. Wood stoves will not be sold or allowed to be sold in the area. We still have the registration of all wood sellers. We still have the real estate requirements that upon sale of a home, a wood stove has to be removed or replaced if it's not EPA certified. I mean, we have still all those regulations will stay in place, and we'll move forward with them.
Nick?
And I just wanted to add that, you know, with the stakeholder group and the serious SIP that's due, there's a, you know, a lot of new control measures that will come in the form of BACM and MSM, which are the best available control measures and the most stringent control measures. When the stakeholder group delivers their final recommendations, those under the, you know, current structure would go to the borough, and then they would go to DEC. And the ones that the borough was, you know, suited to implement, then those would eventually go in front of the APCC and then in front of the assembly. And so it would give the community, you know, additional chances to comment and to, you know, make those recommendations from the stakeholder group really fit for Fairbanks. And if the borough is not able to regulate, then all of those control measures, the borough's not going to obviously implement them if they can't regulate. And so then they would all run through the state process, and so that would essentially miss the local input from the Pollution Control Commission and the Borough Assembly.
All right. I keep hearing that if the borough no longer has control of the PM 2.5 air quality issue and the state takes it over, the state doesn't have the funds for enforcement. Well, why can't the state troopers enforce it? I'm just reading the question. Don't look at me like that.
Cindy and I are looking at each other like, whoa, who wants to take that one? I'm just not sure on the answer of that one.
Well, I think the state troopers have a higher priority in their jobs, you know, keeping us safe and keeping our property safe and dealing with the things that they're barely able to handle as it is. While we all find the air quality very important, I would think that those kind of things have a little higher priority. If there was extra troopers, we've asked troopers in the past for help. During the I&M program, there was times when we asked a trooper to go with us when we needed to serve a document or two to some people that were being recalcitrant. We could probably still do that if we needed to this time around. So we have used them, but they're under a whole different group, under a different department. They have different priorities, different funding. So that's their, it's not their responsibility. So they wouldn't be the primary enforcers, but we have in the past asked for their help when needed, and if we needed to, we would ask for their help again.
All right. Tim?
I was going to add, it's a similar answer. Again, going back to that placer mining experience, we did have cases where we had federal marshals going with EPA inspectors out to placer mining sites. There's a, you know, the what if about this is really hard, right? Because it has its own What does government do to respond to a challenge? it depends. But what I think happens is government finds a way to do what it's legally obliged to do. And the Clean Air Act has a very clear requirement to achieve the particulate matter standard here as well as everywhere else. And it may be faster, it may be slower, it may be gentler, it may be firmer, but sooner or later we'll have to figure out what needs to be done and we'll do it. And I think in general it's done, as I said before, less flexibly, less nimbly, and more in a one-size-fits-all manner. And I think that's true whether it's the state having its go at it before maybe it gives up and says, EPA, you do it. Or maybe not. Maybe they stick with it, right? Maybe the governor says, I'm not going to have federal marshals coming in and telling people what to do. We'll handle this ourselves. You just don't know until these things happen. I guess what I feel like is, is it really even worth going there? We're making progress. It's a hard road, but as I said to my colleagues here, we can do this the hard way, or we can do it the harder way. And most of these questions are like, well, how much harder would it be? And we don't really know the answer. I think personally, I'm convinced it'd be a whole lot harder, and it's really not in our collective interest to go that way.
Tim, has the EPA ever withheld highway funds from someone else not meeting the clean air standard?
I believe so, but we're gonna, Justin's telling me yes. Oh, yeah. I don't have the particulars at hand, but I do believe we have withheld funds. And in Arizona, is that one place, do you know? I have to double check the area. Yeah. We've gone through that. Okay, so the answer is yes.
And just to be clear, it's not EPA that's going to hold your funds. If this is, it's Federal Highway Administration. So what happens is EPA sets the sanction clock ends, FHWA goes, oh, okay, sanctions, they just take the money. EPA is not involved in that point. If it's Federal Highway Administration because it's their funds, they stop them, and they stop them very quickly. So there's no, they've done that. They do it actually quite often. They've not under sanction, but they did do it in Anchorage for failure to do their conformity. So we lost federal highway funds for a year on a project. On all our non-safety projects were on hold for over a year. So I've seen it happen. FHWA they have no latitude. They just do it.
Okay. The PM 2.5 project is moving forward at glacial speed. Oh, this is Alaska. Glacial speed would be appropriate in Alaska, right? What can be done to accelerate the process? And then sort of like the flip side of that, though, can compliance timelines be extended? Which would slow the process, I guess. But anyway, what about the speed? Can we speed it up? And can we extend timelines? Who wants to?
In terms of the timelines, I don't think that we can extend the timeline. We're pretty close to the end of the road. It's as Tim has mentioned, this comes from the Clean Air Act, so it's coming from Congress. You have 10 years to get an area into attainment. We have mentioned that we plan to submit a serious SIP application with an extension request. That may, that's of course, this is the potentiality. If EPA approves that in a particular time frame, then we may get an extension of up to 5 years. But we're really sort of playing at the end of the clock, I would say. I'm not sure if you would characterize that any differently.
No, I think that's right. The other side of that question, this is where I wanted to actually give a shout out to the stakeholder group, because what you're all doing is a really heavy lift, and we really appreciate it. I guess the answer to that question is, how quickly can you finish your deliberations and give the borough something to present to the assembly that can be turned over to the state, that can be written into a SIP, that can be approved? That's the path we need, and the faster we go down it, the better. Yeah, it can go faster, but I'm not the one to tell people
And the thing
exactly how to do that.
The thing about it is,
so.
we in March, we put out the preliminary drafts of a lot of components of the SIP, and that was unprecedented. Usually people don't do preliminary draft documents. That got the stakeholder thing going. We at that point made a conscientious decision that this was too important process to do for us to just roll over it. So we have slowed down. We still are working on a lot of things, but we need to have the input from the stakeholders. We need that recommendation. We think it's worth the wait and the pain that we have to go through after November to try what we have to do to try to get a SIP through and get it done, because we think it's that important.
Yeah, Glenn.
Yeah, and I don't know if from looking at what we've done from the borough perspective over the last 8 years, when we started this program in 2010, and looking at the changes that have been made within this program over that 8-year period, I think the last time we looked, we had an average of an ordinance twice a year that changed the dynamics of the program. So I don't know if there's a way that we really could have moved faster than what we have, because the program was constantly being changed. It was constantly being adjusted based on what the community was looking for. And, I think if we were to, try to move faster on some of these things, we probably would have lost public support. I mean, there's members of the public that aren't happy now. And Wendy, she made that comment this morning that, the wood burners probably should have been engaged a little deeper earlier on. And I'm sorry that didn't happen. And maybe you're right. Maybe that should have occurred. And maybe it could have made this process go a little faster. But I think from my perspective, looking at what the borough has done and the changes that they've made and trying to work with the community, I think it would be tougher to move faster. I know it's, Tim thinks we could have moved faster. Maybe from a bigger agency perspective, they probably would say, well, this is what we're doing and this is how we have to get there. And maybe, it would be quicker from a larger agency perspective, and maybe DEC would do it that way also. But from the borough perspective, there's a lot of channels that it has to work through as far as the commission and the assembly and the mayor's office, and it's a slower process, but it's more integrated with the community.
Sounds good. After a review of last year's air pollution data with number of days above 35, what do you recommend that the borough change about our air quality program? And this is a question for the state or EPA. The person is asking that. So, state and EPA, what should the borough change after looking at the data from last year?
Well, certainly one thing that I think the borough can consider, that once again, this has been a borough program and the borough has made these choices, is Nick has talked about the borough has been pretty conservative in calling curtailments. And I can understand why the borough did it that way, especially when you have a relatively, new, not completely new, but that curtailment program has evolved, and you'll be conservative probably coming out of the gate. But after you have a season behind you and you're able to look back and think about those statistics overall, you can consider whether or not you want to be, whether you need to be less conservative in calling curtailments this coming winter.
I guess you could think of an all of the above strategy. Less restrained in calling bans. You could call more bans. You could consider having when you find noncompliance, moving more quickly to a harsher penalty. You could have more inspectors out on the roads looking for noncompliance. You could look for ways to make the change-out fund, the amount of funding in that pot bigger, and the incentives available under the program greater. To me, I still come down as it's a carrots and sticks sort of dynamic, and the more robust the carrots are, the better. In some ways, the more robust the sticks are, the better. Of course, finding resources for all that is the big trick. But that's what comes to mind, is pick the things that you think are making the biggest difference and find a way to enhance those.
Okay. What is the difference in particulate matter emissions between wood, ULSD, and natural gas? And we're going to have more on this tomorrow at a presentation, I believe, but somebody want to hit that for us? Wood, ULSD, which is ultra-low sulfur diesel, and natural gas.
Oh, we have a picture on our website that has that.
Well,
but I don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
There's a picture on your website. They can check it out. Nick?
I think kind of rough order of magnitude numbers between wood and ULSD is around two orders of magnitude. So it's 100 times, ULSD is 100 times less than wood. And ULSD and natural gas are actually fairly similar when it comes to PM 2.5.
All right. Would the EPA give us credit for improving energy efficiency on our buildings, homes, etc., thus reducing heat demand and thus reducing emissions?
Probably. It really comes down to the analysis and the documentation that would support it. An interesting question is how much effort in terms of the analysis would it take? What would be, if it did pencil out, what sort of budget would you need to be able to invest in energy efficiency? And then what does that all calculate out to as a reduction in PM 2.5? So I could certainly see that being part of the mix, and whether it actually makes sense to include it really depends on the analysis your folks would be doing. You and the state, and we've got people who would help with that, but it would have to be analyzed and documented, and we'd go from there.
Yeah, but it also has to be federally enforceable.
No.
So you have to have a program. If you're going to have weatherization, you would have to have a very specific laid out requirements that could then be federally enforceable, so that any analysis and credit emission reductions claimed is a requirement. So it's maintainable. You have to, if you reduce emissions, you have to show the emissions, and you have to show that it's maintainable. Mm-hmm. So that's what a whole part of a program is all about.
Tall order.
Yeah. It's not easy.
You guys keep like making this complicated. Yeah, so many things make so much common sense, but they're not as easily accomplished as we would hope, I guess. Would requiring ESPs be an accepted control measure? Or maybe better asked, what would it take to get ESPs to be an accepted control measure?
I guess,
Nick.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So, I think as Cindy brought up earlier, that for a control measure, it has to be permanent and enforceable and result in emission reductions. And so an example where ESPs would be a control measure is there are the no-ash households, or the no other adequate source of heat. And if you were to require ESP installation on those households and mandate it, then it would be enforceable and it would result in emission reductions. And then the question comes in, how much emission reductions do you get, and how much credit do you get? And that comes down to the level of data that you have. With the current data that we have on those, it's not the best quality data. So maybe the emission reductions that we get are somewhere around 40%. But hopefully with better emission testing data, that number could be refined and more credit could be given.
Which is why the Borough Assembly just put $458,000 into doing some testing. The latest DEC model suggests that all wood burning must cease to make attainment Does that model include burning done with stage 1 and no ash waivers? Did you follow that? Does your model calculate that some people are still burning and there's some, we have compliance rates and percentages, and go for it?
So what we did was we did a very general, very simple analysis for the stakeholder group in which we moved everybody from wood to oil. So you still had all the oil emissions except for the no ash. So they were given the ability to keep burning because that's they're burning anyway, right? So it's a very simple calculations, moving everybody from wood to oil. You still have those emissions, and we could show attainment that way. So if you removed all the wood, you could show attainment. That's simple, okay? When you get into a lot more, and that's not realistic. So the trick is now we have to find what is an acceptable burning with how much wood reduction, wood smoke reduction that we need, plus all these other control measures and natural gas coming in and enforcement and compliance percentages. So it's not an easy thing, but we do know that simply moving everybody to oil does show attainment.
I just want to jump on and add to that. It's sort of a different question, but I think it's an important one for folks in the community to consider. Cindy just said that the analysis shows that if you took everybody off, you could achieve attainment, and then she said that's not realistic. Inside EPA, we've got people who would say, well, if that's what it shows, that's what the community needs to do. End of discussion. Go curtail. Stop talking about more time and more money and more anything else. And if they don't do it, let the sanctions clock, come in and hammer away at the community till they are willing to do it. Now, those of us in Region 10, EPA Region 10, where I come from and Justin and Dan come from, part of our job being regional EPA employees is to say to folks who think in that very linear and not very community-friendly way of thinking. It's our job, along with our partners locally and at the state level, to say why what Cindy said is true. It's not realistic, here's why. So if we don't have our partners helping us communicate the message that that's not realistic in this community, it's harder for us to prevail on those who would say one size fits all is the way to go here. So the fact is, though, that analysis is probably valid. It may not be realistic, but it's probably valid as a logical proposition. So again, I think there's just so much more opportunity for the community to get where the law requires it to go by continuing to have local and state engagement. That I really hope that that's what happens.
All right. Tim, has the EPA considered the applicability of an environmental justice program to address the economic hardship of the community to move to more expensive fuel?
It's a good question. We haven't done the analysis. I'm not sure what that analysis would look like. In general, the sort of environmental justice concerns go to, is there, for instance, a large industrial facility that's having a disproportionate impact on an environmental justice community? And so are we writing our permit stringently enough to protect them? This dynamic, what you're asking me here is, can the cost of compliance on a population that is not as economically well off be a reason to not require compliance? I think the answer is very, very likely no. That's not how environmental justice works. That said, that is very much why we're supportive of the no ash and why no ash provisions are common in curtailment programs, and why things like the change-out program and the incentives that come with it make a great deal of sense. So I don't think EJ considerations would say, okay, never mind, you don't have to meet the Clean Air Act. But it does, but that line of thinking is why we're very supportive of no ash provisions and incentives.
So from some conversations we've had at our meetings, I've picked up on the EPA having a problem that I experience periodically with decisions not always being made ultimately with the frontline regulators and such, but with our legal department. And we have affectionate names for those departments in different agencies. I've heard, the Department of No as one potential suggestion. And I'm guessing that they're engaged in this decision-making process that you were just describing, that you would have to get the attorneys to agree that it wouldn't be your decision necessarily.
Yeah, so we have an Office of Regional Counsel, and we also have an Office of General Counsel. And in matters such as state implementation plans, and certainly in a matter as significant as the Fairbanks 2.5 implementation plan, we get opinions from a lot of people. And there's a lot of back and forth and discussion about what can we approve and what we can't, and what's the rationale, and how is that different than what we did over here and over there. And so, yes, I'd say we have, it's sometimes tough, those conversations. As a recovering attorney, I can say that sometimes conversations with people from my former profession are difficult, but they're smart, and they're ultimately reasonable, and ultimately it isn't actually their call. We have other people, we can always elevate issues as we need to. So, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of people who help us reach a conclusion, and especially on something as significant as this, that will be the dynamic.
Denise.
So I'm not going to speak to environmental justice the way that Tim did, but I'm just thinking about the other theme there of cost, which is an element of the environmental justice. And as Tim said, that's why we know there will always be no ashes, and there's always an allowance for no ashes. And just wanted to mention that we've talked about the cost of compliance. We've talked about the cost of fuel. Those might actually be easier to quantify, but I just wanted to at least acknowledge that there is another side to that ledger, which is the cost of the health impacts to people in the community. It's harder to quantify, but certainly I've heard about the concerns and the cost of buying fuel, and that's a real cost. But there's also costs on the other side of the ledger that are also real as well, in terms of people bearing health costs and having expensive medical procedures and those sorts of things. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there are multiple types of costs associated with this issue.
I'm going to kind of combine two questions here. What do you think it will take to clean up the air in North Pole? And we've been talking at our meetings that it's going to require about 80% reduction in wood smoke. And so the follow-up, or the question here is, have any other communities had to reduce 80% of their emissions? And did they succeed?
So let me start this one.
Okay, Glenn.
So I can't speak to the other communities. I'm going to leave that up to EPA. But one of the things that why we have the burn demo out there and why we thought it was so important to have that is I still see a lot of stacks with lots of blue smoke coming out of them. So there's a lot of people that are still not using their stoves the way they should be. So when we talk about curtailment programs, to meet whatever, or the reductions that we need, you guys don't slug me now, all right? I'm going out on a limb on this. And I'm still not convinced that a total curtailment program would be completely necessary if we were to get the community, as the wood burners, as a whole, to start using all of the stoves appropriately. And I don't know the answer to that, but I know that I still see, when I drive through North Pole, And I'm sure that you can see it too when you drive through. You just look around and you smell it and you look and there's one smoking and there's another one smoking and not a little bit, but a lot. And you wonder if we could just get those cleaned up, what that would do for that 80% that we need to get to. And it's possible that maybe those that are burning clean can still continue to burn. And, you know, that's my hope with, you know, where we're going with this. And, you know, the educational component is very important. And I still know there's a lot of folks that, you know, they don't have a good stove, or it's not installed properly, or they're just not burning the appropriate fuel. And if we could get them to do that, I just wonder how far we could get without the, you know, the more draconian measures that we're faced with right now. And, you know, I'll let either DEC or EPA answer the rest of that question.
Nick's going to jump in first.
Yeah, and so to continue Glenn's discussion there, 80% emission reductions, what does that look like as far as the saturation point? So how many stoves can still be operated and still achieve that 80% emission reduction? I think that's a number that, you know, in particular, the stakeholder group wants to see. And the difficulty with that number is it's a moving target. What Glenn was talking about there is the cleaner that we can get the operation, the more efficient that we can get them, the more of the dirty or uncertified devices we can get out, the more of that we can accomplish, the higher that number goes. And so what does 80% emission reduction look like? The answer is it depends. It could be as stringent as nothing else other than no ashes operating in North Pole, or with the appropriate control measures in place, coupled with the appropriate level of enforcement, you know, that number could be significantly higher.
Anybody else dare to jump in on that one?
I think the original question was, are there any of the communities with high? And I think there's been a number of small communities in the mountains, like ski areas, like Libby, Montana, where they changed out every single stove because they were little, but that was all wood smoke. So there's little communities. I think we're one of the biggest up here, wood smoke dominant communities in the nation. But I'm guessing on that. But you know, the other serious non-attainment areas, they have other issues, not just wood smoke. They have a wood smoke component.
I would add, and it's not a perfect analogy, but Juneau had a PM10 problem, but it was before there was a PM 2.5 standard, and really the problem was caused by wood burning. And Juneau had, I know Juneau's not as cold, clearly. Like I said, it's not a perfect analogy, but there were levels that were in the hundreds, and they did get into attainment, and they are in maintenance. But every community has a unique aspect to it.
Nick wanted to jump back in.
Yeah, Missoula, Montana, who we had, one of the folks, Ben from Missoula, was up here at last year's conference, and he talked about how bad the problem in Missoula was. That, again, it was a PM10 issue, so it's not, it doesn't exactly correlate to the numbers that we see, but they had numbers in the 200 range, I believe, and up to 300 for PM10. And, they were dealing with the issue back in the late 80s. And, he said that it took the community, a couple of decades. It took them 20-some years to work through all the issues with the problem. And, he said that a couple of the necessary things were a change-out program, limiting the new devices to just the cleanest devices. I believe they went to pellet stoves only in Missoula, and then robust enforcement of a curtailment program. And he said that curtailment is the most difficult thing to implement, but it was necessary for that community to reach it, and it was a similar magnitude to what we're dealing with here.
Are they still doing curtailments?
Yeah, they're still doing curtailments, I think. I'm trying to recall from his from his presentation, I think they said they were down to one or two no ash houses, and they were still running curtailments.
And Juneau has them occasionally, right? They don't seem to have them.
Oh, burn bans?
Uh-huh.
They do still happen, but they are less frequent.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Some are saying sanctions are an empty threat. Please share recent examples, or any examples, of required 2-to-1 offsets or highway fund cessations around the U.S.
I'll take that one, Carl.
Have you found any information in that
I think
regard?
you showed this question to Justin, who happened to bring his laptop over. And helpfully, there is actually it's at the it's the highway website, Federal Highways website, Federal Highway Administration, Clean Air Act sanctions table. Currently, there are 2 jurisdictions under, I believe, both the 2-to-1 offset sanction and the federal highway sanction, federal highway fund sanction. So the 2-to-1 offset sanction, if I'm getting this right, means you have to sort of come up with double the savings before any new source can come into the jurisdiction. So so that just makes the job harder for economic growth to occur. And then the highway sanction is obviously a little more clear about what that means. But yeah, so East Helena in Montana and Butte County in California are both currently under sanctions. And then there's about 8 others that the threat, as they got close to the date, the threat of that reality coming through got everyone to get creative, and sanctions have been stayed as various new approaches were developed, presumably, to stave off those sanctions. So, so some of these are a little. The Butte County one is a 2017 date. East Helena goes back farther, 1996. And then most of the rest are at the ones where it was avoided and or has been deferred to date are dates in between. So if it makes sense, we can just share the link to the web page, but it's quite a long link. But it starts going to the FHWA .dot.gov website, and for those who are so inclined, you can look under the Environment tab, and that'll get you going to the the Clean Air Act sanctions page.
So if folks want more information on that, they can corner Justin and his laptop and get that.
And I'm going to make sure he gets it,
okay,
so I don't get cornered.
All right. He's trying to hide against the wall, but we can still see him.
Yeah.
All right. Don't get offended, State of Alaska. This is somewhat overly generically stated, but I'm going to read it, so it's not me. I'm just the messenger. Under state management, we fell into serious non-attainment. With local management, we're making progress. If the state is back in charge, how will we breathe cleaner?
And Cindy and I are looking at each other. Maybe I'll get started and Cindy can jump in. This is another one of those questions about the sort of I think what Tim said, the what if. As I mentioned, the state does have the ability to call curtailments, do those sorts of things. We're going to be blunter, I think, than you will be at a local level. We're not going to do things like ESPs. We would still have to call curtailments. We hope that some of the other control measures and people's good burning practices and some of the outreach would reduce the number of times that we hit that threshold, so you have to call curtailments. But I would expect that would still be part of the mix, and we would still do compliance and enforcement, and we'll, part of this whole Clean Air Act regime, whether it's administered at the local level or the state level, or even, ultimately it can wind up at the federal level, it is a sort of a ratcheting down process. You don't go to the most strict, most stringent levels of controls right away. So that's why there was, a moderate area, and there was time and opportunity to make progress while we were moderate. Not enough progress was made. We all feel pretty bad about that, but that's the reality. That's a partnership between everyone in this room and everyone at this table. And then once we became designated as a serious area, now now we ratchet down again. But that's sort of the nature of the process, and that's the process that the Clean Air Act envisions. The alternative is just immediately, when you're in non-attainment, jumping to the most strict level of control measures, and I don't think that's a better scenario.
Just to add to that, though, this is where, it would take time for the state, and then if it came to the feds, sort of getting a curtailment program up and running and implemented it would take some time. So what that would also mean is the sanctions clocks are ticking, and may start to take effect as other entities figure out how they would actually bring the area into attainment. So the unfortunate thing about the nearly 10 years that have passed since the original designation is a lot of that, time to figure things out is pretty much gone, and sanctions loom. So even though there's a lot of questions being asked about, well, what would you really do and how would it really work, and we're not really sure, at this today how it would really work and what would really happen, the sanctions clock would keep ticking, and that we can be sure of.
I think this can be a quick question for you, Nick. I hope the school monitoring program continues, because many people think the problem is not in their neighborhood and it's only at North Pole or Wood River or Watershed. How much will it cost to continue? Are you planning on continuing? What's the status of that program?
Absolutely. The status is we're going to continue the exact same school monitoring program that we did last year. We have that under contract for this year, and we're on track to get things up and running in the near future. And I believe our budget line item for that is around $78,000 per year to continue, and so we will be asking for that continuation again with our regular budgeting cycle.
All right. Why don't we look at what Whitehorse Yukon Territory did to improve their quality? They had a problem. What'd they do? Is anyone familiar with Whitehorse's problem? Everybody's...
I remember hearing something about it, and I'll just repeat what I've said maybe too many times now. Curtailment and changeouts is what pretty much every community that's faced this problem has embraced as the tools to solve it. It's admittedly harder here. It is colder here, fuel's more expensive here, but those elements of what communities elsewhere have done are the elements that are being used here, and that's got to continue. I guess the thing that's new here is if there is a technological fix to make burning wood as clean as the other alternatives, it's like an ESP. If there is that magic bullet, that would be a first. That would make this community different, and I'm sure a lot of communities would appreciate it if you can find something like that that really does work. So necessity may be the mother of invention, and maybe that's where the answer lies. But every community that we know about has used some combination of curtailment and changeouts to get to the standard.
All right, to Glenn or Nick, in communities that did change-outs, PM reductions were not as significant as expected, largely because of wet wood still being used, among other behavior issues such as lack of maintenance. Where is the emphasis on education? Glenn said, couldn't this be a more deliberate approach? Educating people about burning practices and why the clean of burning. So where's our emphasis on education? What are we doing on this?
Well, as part of the wood stove changeout program, that is a requirement of participating in the program, that they watch a Burn Wise video, they take a quiz, we make sure that they have proper wood storage capability and that they understand how to use a stove. So the education component is an integral piece of our program. It needs to continue. And obviously, you know, we haven't quite gotten there yet. And, you know, back to what I was saying before, you know, years ago when we had a carbon monoxide problem, you know, it was assumed that anywhere from 10 to 20% of the automobiles that were causing the problem, you know, it was a small percentage. 80% of the cars were mostly clean. So it's kind of the same thing here, I believe. You know, when you look at who, or, you know, the stoves that are emitting, it's probably a relatively small percentage of the burners that are creating, you know, a larger percent of the problem. And I think if we could solve that problem, I think we can get a long way in this community.
Could I add that, you know, I started, this is my third Clear the Air conference, and every time I've been up here, a demonstration project, a demonstration of what's needed to burn wood well has been a strong emphasis. And my take was, you know, I think this group needs to be talking about the possibility of, you know, no matter how well you do it, it's still not going to be good enough. So how do we balance the, yes, we want everyone burning as cleanly as they can and find out how far that takes us. But if it doesn't take us far enough, you know, we need to be talking about burn bans and change outs. And I think the borough's done a great job finding the balance between, you know, educating and bringing people along and helping people know how to burn the right way. And if anything, I'd say the borough's maybe leaned a little too much that way and not enough on the other ways to get there. So I find the question interesting, but for my part, I came here in year 7 of 10, and found that the dialogue focused mostly on how to burn better, and I'm like, I thought we needed to be talking about maybe how to just not burn as much, and I think the balance now is in the right place, and as I said, and we've said before, time is short. But I'm a little surprised by the question, and maybe this is just my outsider perspective coming in. But I came to the dance late and was a little surprised at what people were dancing to.
Let the record show I didn't pay him to say that. Nick, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just you know, agree with all the previous comments made, and also agree that the emissions from wood devices are dependent on the willingness and expertise of every homeowner to operate it correctly and use the correct fuel. You might have heard me say that a few times before. And so, yeah, it's very important. And I think going back to Tim's point, the more people that we can reach and get that message to burn correctly, the more numbers of stoves that can operate, and we can still hit attainment. If we don't reach those numbers, then we've got, you know, if we don't reach those people with that message, then we've got to reduce the number of wood stoves significantly in order to hit attainment. And the borough has put substantial resources into, you know, doing ads on, you know, television, on the radio. We're on the in the newspaper and social media. We go to conferences. There are, you know, several outreach efforts, and I know that the folks from the stakeholder group have some, they definitely have some suggestions on the way we can improve our education and outreach program, and we've heard some suggestions today that we can improve it by, you know, updating our website. So I want to get the message out to the community to please continue to provide us feedback on how we can improve, because we're always trying to work on that effort.
All right. We are out of time, but I only have one more question, and this will be the first time we ever got through all the audience questions. If I could do one more, so I'm going to do it. Is there a current borough ordinance that allows the assessor's office to go onto private property to determine if a homeowner or business owns a wood stove? I know you're not attorneys, but Nick?
And I will paraphrase because we have this answer written down, but in theory, yes, the assessor's office may look like they have that ability. But in practice, the assessor's office does not look into home windows or do anything. In fact, that practice is absolutely discouraged, and you know, each assessor, when they go through training, the assessor discourages that. What they do is they do ask if they see a homeowner present, which is not very often, they will ask to go inside to complete their assessment, and not surprisingly, most of the time they are not granted permission to go inside. So the reality of it is that they, you know, do not have the ability to go in and collect that information. The other limitation is that they do assessments on a 6-year basis, and so by the time you would get a full inventory of devices, it would be 6 years down the road. And hearing some of the timing constraints that we've heard today, that's probably not going to help us out much.
All right. Let's thank our panel for taking the hot seats here. And thank you for participating. Mr. Williams, I think, might have a closing comment or whatever.
Good to see you.
So we have a closing task. Last call to enter the drawing for the door prizes. We're going to do that right now. So I need a volunteer. John, come on up and draw a name.
On everything, yeah.
Get those control measures. Swag from Explore Fairbanks.
Explore Fairbanks, thank you. We have some wonderful swag here. John's going to draw for this prize. You ready?
I gotta go.
Oh, it's John Burns. Lisa Herbert, where are you at, Lisa?
She's not here.
Not here.
Do you have to be present to win?
Yes, you need
think
You
we
have
need
to be
change the
present
rules,
to
make
win.
sure, present to win.
All right, next one,
Okay,
John.
next one. Donna Brady Robertson.
Donna Brady Robertson. Donna?
Donna here?
Saw her earlier.
Oh, come on. Okay, here we go. One more.
Yeah, you just draw direct. There we go, real quick.
I didn't put a name
Yeah.
in. Here we go.
Okay, Arnold.
Arnold Chiglick. Arnold?
Yay!
Yay! Come on up, Arnold. Okay, Arnold's going to be our next drawer.
Okay. So you can.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Vanna.
Vanna. Okay, Arnold, so you have a task. You're going to be our next drawer. Can you do our drawing? Draw the next
Draw
one?
for the next prize.
Okay, the next prize is...
A solar charger courtesy of.
Okay, I'm taking this one off the list because it's like really cool and it would go good on my boat, but it's a solar charger, so anything solar and charger in the same word has got to be really cool. So let's do this.
Ready?
Who do we got here? Darcia Grace. Darcia? Darsha? Does she? Oh, no. Next.
Okay, I'm sorry. We'll pick another one because that person's not there. It's okay.
This looks pretty.
It's way.
Carl Joy Degerland. Joy? I don't see Joy.
My word.
Oh boy, this is fun.
All right.
I see people leaving. That's
Gotta
dangerous.
stay because the next one's for the woodshed. Ooh, he's here.
I know this person. Dan Givens.
Where's Dan Gibbons?
Dan.
Run.
Congratulations, Dan.
Let me have those other blue things.
Can you draw the next ones for us?
Okay, so this is for
Yeah,
the
can you draw the
woodshed.
next ones?
All right.
Okay, this is for the woodshed.
The first of two woodshed.
First of two. We'll do the other one tomorrow, right?
Tomorrow.
Yeah. So it's not a chicken coop.
Yeah, nor is it.
It's not a two-place outhouse.
No.
It's a woodshed. And Jay Fair. Jay, are you in here?
Yay!
Jay, all right. First time. Okay, well, thank you for participating in the...
Tell everybody about what time tomorrow.
Yep, I'm going to get to that. I got instructions coming all over the place. Okay, so we're wrapping up today. We're going to push the pause button right now, and we're going to connect back up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Okay, what time tomorrow morning?
9
9 o'clock. See you bright and early. Signing out. Bye.
Breakfast, all right.
Okay, so we're good to go.